Okay, so today we are very lucky to have Hoda Abdel Magid speak with us. She is a relatively new faculty member in our department up in health behavior research, who comes to us most recently from Stanford in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics there, with expertise in I'll say spatial epidemiology and spatial sciences. And today she's going to talk about spatial social polarization and its impact on hypertension and dementia. Okay, Hoda, it's all you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, first off, I really want to thank you, Dave, for the invitation. I know it's not easy dealing with everybody's schedules, including my own, so I appreciate you for inviting me. It's really great to be here with the division and to see so many familiar faces. I really wish I could be there in person, but as I've learned from my toddler, who is 13 months, flexibility is a survival skill at this point. So I appreciate you. Bearing with me here as I present online. So, as Dave mentioned, my name is Hoda Abdul Majid. I'm an assistant professor. I joined USC in September of 2023 in the Division of Health Behavior Research, and I have a joint appointment with SSI over at Dornsife. My research in general focuses on how the environment shapes chronic disease outcomes in older adults and how that shapes aging, specifically how what I call spaces and places in the environment shape health. So I'll get into that later, but spaces being the physical environment and places being the social environment. I try to use methods from spatial sciences and from causal inference to try to quantify the environmental effects, which are really complex. So today I'm going to share two studies that build from that work that's funded by a mix of different grants, including my RRO from NHLBI and a RICMAR pilot that's funded to folks over at the Price and Jarrow schools here at USC. I will say, though, that I'm going to present this work and I'm going to show you these results, and then I'm going to say a disclaimer about what I think is fundamentally wrong with this work and why I think our entire field should move away from this one index approach, is what I call it. So I'm going to present the one index approach, an example of it, and then I'm going to tell you why I think we should move away from it. But it is currently the work that I'm funded to do. So with that said, I'm going to share two studies that build on this work, specifically that examine hypertension and dementia. They're very related. They share the same exposure, but they are A, in different cohorts and data sets, and B, measure slightly different things in terms of the overall analyses. So here's a quick roadmap for what I'll cover today. I'll begin with a really brief background to set up the motivation for this work. I'll try not to bore you. I know many folks in the audience are super familiar with a lot of this literature. And then I'll describe how I measure spatial social polarization. I'll just call that SSP from now on, using the index of concentration at the extremes. I used to have a running joke about this acronym for this measure. It stands for ICE. Was not aptly named then and is not aptly named now. So this is what it's called, the index of concentration at the extremes, or ICE. So I'll briefly outline the data sources and methods, and then I'll walk through two applications for hypertension and for dementia. And then I'll close with the few takeaways that I mentioned. And please feel free to stop me anytime for questions or clarifications. So, starting with hypertension, it's one of the most common chronic conditions in the United States. Nearly half of American adults have hypertension, and prevalence continues to rise each year. The patterns for hypertension, they're not uniform. Black adults experience higher prevalence and worse outcomes than other groups. And beyond individual behaviors, like many diseases, it is also spatially patterned. The neighborhoods, the environments, the zip codes that people live in, and the resources or stressors that those areas provide all can strongly influence hypertension risk. And hypertension is one of the outcomes that the environmental health and social and spatial epidemiology has really shown a lot of evidence for the influence of multiple domains of the environment on hypertension. So features like access to healthy food, green space, medical care, and exposure to chronic stress have all shown to be substantially vary by location, and then subsequently associated with hypertension and hypertension disparities. So these differences ultimately reflect some broader social determinants of health that operate across multiple levels, from the individual to the neighborhood, for example, to the structural levels. So understanding how that patterning can help us provide a foundation for thinking about how the environment shapes other chronic conditions as well, not just hypertension. But the end goal is to be able to identify the domains within a given environment that affects a given outcome the most in order to target interventions as strategic and as efficient as possible. So for dementia, this is the figure from the 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia. If you go to any talk on dementia or Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, this figure will pop up approximately many times in a slide, in a slide deck. So it's really important because it shows that about 40% of dementia cases are potentially preventable through modifiable risk factors across the life course. So early life education, midlife hypertension, which is closely related to dementia, and hearing loss, and then later life factors like social isolation and depression all contribute to risk. So these patterns highlight that dementia isn't inevitable, just like hypertension. It's shaped by lifelong social and environmental conditions, which again points to the importance and need to study how spaces and places in an environment influence, in this case, brain health or hypertension. So that brings us to a little bit more background, sorry, on dementia. So dementia is another area where we see large and persistent disparities, just like hypertension. Just like hypertension, Black and Hispanic adults face higher prevalence and earlier onset of dementia compared to white adults. Again, it's also spatially patterned. Rates differ by geographic areas in ways that mirror, excuse me, a lot of the inequities in the physical and social environment. So, but dementia hasn't been as explored as much in terms of the environmental effects on it as other chronic disease outcomes, including hypertension. So, to capture that, the construct called spatial social polarization, developed by sociologist Douglas Massey in early, I think in 2001, or SSP, quantifies how privilege and deprivation are distributed within and across a given geographic area. So it looks at how polarized an area is, and I'll dive into that. But that's the main point of this measure, is that it looks at how polarized for any given domain a geographic area is. So it allows us to not just study disadvantage and that it exists, but how unevenly that disadvantage is concentrated within a given geographic area. And so because hypertension and dementia share so many risk pathways, we're not going to get into it, SSP can provide a useful way to examine the environmental roots of both of these diseases. So that brings me to the conceptual work for this talk. This slide summarizes how I'm thinking about the connection between hypertension, dementia, and the environment. So again, both the conditions show clear geographic variation, not only across states, but at finer spatial scales like counties, zip codes, census tracts, and lower neighborhood socioeconomic status and less supportive built environments consistently have been shown to be related to both conditions. Definitely hypertension more so than dementia, since it's been studied more. So there's still a major research gap, though. We need measures that can capture both the socioeconomic and the structural conditions across a given geographic area, and can capture that at multiple spatial levels. And the reason for this is, again, to be able to identify at which level, in which domain, would an intervention be the most effective for a given outcome. So again, so SSP quantifies how privilege and deprivation are distributed, essentially how concentrated inequality is within a given area. Compared with a lot of traditional measures, whether it's the Gini coefficient or the index of dissimilarity, the index of concentration at the extremes, or ICE, or any other index of SSP, has shown to have several advantages, including the fact that it's flexible across spatial scales. So when I show you how we calculate the measure, you could pretty much calculate it for any spatial scale. So you can calculate for a zip code, a county, a tract, and so forth. And it's sensitive to the distribution rather than the simple averages, which is again what we're trying to look at. Across many things, it has been shown to outperform a lot of these indices that are used in spatial and social epidemiology, like the Gini coefficient or the index of dissimilarity. So the framework that guides this work assumes that SSP is a shared socioeconomic and structural driver of both hypertension and dementia disparities. So the hypotheses here is basically that higher SSP is associated with higher hypertension and dementia. And then the second hypothesis, which is the PIMs model that I will go through, is that eliminating a difference in, specifically in this case, in socioeconomic SSP would help reduce hypertension and dementia at the population level. I know these are a little hard to see here, but what I want to show you here is that this is originally how I looked at how I think of the conceptual framework here, is that the social construct of race is operating through both socioeconomic and structural pathways to influence the outcomes. In this case, hypertension and ADRD. So SSP has been examined before for other chronic disease outcomes, including cancer, but it has never been examined in terms of its structural domains. So this is what's very, very novel here, is that no one has ever examined one, parsed out the socioeconomic from the structural domains of SSP, and two, calculated them for things like food, recreation, healthcare, and housing. So again, other studies have looked at socioeconomic SSP, but part of this work and work that I'm building towards, again, is to separate out the physical environment from the social environment. And this is the beginning of this work. So the work today that I will present is all about the socioeconomic SSP measures, the socioeconomic ICE measures, and work that my lab and I are working on is to calculate the structural SSP measures. And so that's what I will work on. That's what I will focus on today. The relationship between socioeconomic SSP and hypertension, socioeconomic SSP and ADRD disparities, and then also the PIMS model for both of them. Okay, so here is a little bit more background about the ICE measure. So to measure SSP, we use two domains, the social and the structural. And you see here income, race, ethnicity, home ownership, education, and language for the socioeconomic measures. So again, these domains describe how privilege and deprivation are distributed across spaces and places. So I'll show you how these are quantified using the index of concentration at the extremes, or ICE. So ICE is a very simple, mathematically super simple calculation. Three numbers. Two in the numerator and one in the denominator. The problem becomes defining each of those components. So it takes for any given geographic area, it takes the number in the ith geographic area who are categorized as belonging to the most privileged extreme for a given domain, and subtracts from that the people that are categorized as belonging to the most deprived extreme for that domain, divided by the entire population whose privilege level was measured for that area. So again, we can calculate this at any spatial level. And here I'll show you, today I'll show you that we've calculated it for the zip code, for the tract, for the county, actually across the entire United States. And these measures are publicly available on our GitHub. So it ranges from -1 to 1. If we have 1, that means an ICE of 1. It means that 100% of the population is in the most extreme -1 is in the most extreme group for deprivation. If we have 1, then 100% of that population is in the most extreme group for privilege. Again, scenarios that are very, very extreme and wouldn't happen, but that's the range that we're looking at. And then an ICE value of 0 means that there's a balance between a perfect balance between the privileged and the deprived groups, indicating that there isn't a significant concentration of either the most deprived or the most privileged group. So the example that I really like to use is to explain this is income. So income, you can think of income SSP or income ICE as measuring how many high income earners and how many low income earners are within a given group, and we're not really focused on folks in the middle at all. So we're just looking at that polarization, those extremes. So how are these calculated and how are they defined? Well, the socioeconomic measures are easier to calculate because it's based off of wonderful work by Dr. Nancy Krieger over at Harvard and Dr. Douglas Massey's work for this measure. So the definitions are, you can use pretty much any definition that you want, but these definitions have been used in the literature before by those two scientists' work. And so these are the definitions that I've used here as well. For income, we are looking at the privileged group is defined as the upper 80th percentile for the US household income. So according to the census, that's folks that earn greater than 100K based on ACS 2010. And for the deprived group, it's the bottom 20th percentile, which is less than 25K based on ACS 2010. So those numbers are really, really crazy numbers for example, for California, right? But even when we do change those numbers, it doesn't really make that much of a difference in terms of the overall findings. So we decided to follow the literature for these definitions. And then we have race, ethnicity, and then we have home ownership, language, race, and income. And probably the most important one in this slide is the race, ethnicity, and income combined domain. So this domain, which I'll show you, is pretty much across the board, including in studies from other scientists, the domain from ICE that is the most predictive of chronic disease outcomes. And I think this is getting at some of the intersectionality that might be happening within a given environment or group. So again, this combined domain is the one that's the most predictive. And so we pulled ACS 5-year estimates from 2010 to 2019 for ICE calculations. I think we actually have them from 2000 all the way to 2019. And we used raw ICE values and we also converted them to quintiles. For some of our analyses, the quintiles were just easier to help us interpret our results and to communicate them. But they're available both continuously and in quintiles. So we calculated them at the census tract, the ZECTA, and the county levels across the entire country. But for some analyses, we only use the ZECTA level. And so all of our measures are available here on a former student's GitHub right here, and they're publicly available. We're happy to share these measures or provide guidance for anyone that's interested in using them. So some quick background for our data sources and our outcome variables. So I'm going to try to kind of combine both studies here for hypertension and dementia. So here, this slide summarizes the general structure of both studies. So for the CMS data that we used a 20% random sample of Medicare beneficiaries that linked across parts A, B, and D. And this is such a wonderful resource that I think many people don't know about at USC. It's available. It's available over from folks at UPC. My team and I also has access to 100% data, but it's too much. We're working our way through it. So for right now, these analyses show results from 20%, the 20% random sample of Medicare beneficiaries. So our outcomes included hypertension and dementia, both derived in the case of CMS using validated algorithms. Dementia was used from code from Dr. Julie Zasmopoulos' team, again, over at Price and Jarrow. Her team's done a wonderful job at coding dementia across all CMS years, I think starting from 2000 to 2019, and that is available. So exposures were our ICE-based measures of social SSP or socioeconomic SSP at the zip code level. For the CMS analysis, it was merged with CMS data. So we did two things. We estimated associations using multi-level mixed effects models, and then two, we used population level effects using PIM models or population intervention models with the G formula. So for hypertension, we found our analytic sample included more than 9 million Medicare beneficiaries. I'm just showing you results here for 1 year. The results are pretty consistent across the years. Hypertension was again identified using the CCW definition for MCMS claims. Hypertension was much easier to classify than dementia. Exposures were the zip code level ICE measures that I mentioned earlier. And then right here, you see some sample demographics. The average age was about 71, predominantly non-Hispanic white, with roughly 9% Black participants. For study two, again, our 20% random sample of the Medicare beneficiaries enrolled in traditional Medicare from 2014 and 2019. Again, only showing you here an analytic window focusing on 2018. And this one had about 8 million beneficiaries per year. So we included beneficiaries aged 67 and older, fully enrolled in Medicare Parts A, B, and D, with at least 2 years of continuous enrollment. And then we excluded those with incomplete enrollment, missing data, or no zip code, since we needed the spatial identifier to be able to link our ICE measures to the individual data. And then we also excluded anyone under 67 to allow for a clean look back period. I'll go into detail about that in a second. Individual covariates included things like age, gender, race, and a range of clinical morbidities. For dementia, things like diabetes, hypertension, stroke, and depression. Again, a lot of this work follows work from Dr. Julie Zasmopoulos' team over at UPC, who has graciously provided us access to detailed claims and code to be able to pick up these dementia diagnoses. So we use a combination of ICD-9 and 10 codes, dementia-related symptoms, and Part D description data for drugs. And then medications were only counted if there was at least a 14-day supply. And all of this is fully detailed on Julie's group's GitHub as well, which I'm happy to provide a link to, and fully detailed in her group's papers, including the ones listed there. So for dementia, we focused on prevalence and incidence. Incidence was much harder to figure out than prevalence. They're again grounded in prior work, completely following their outcome classifications because it was just really hard not to. For prevalence, we required a second confirmatory diagnosis code within 1 year of the initial diagnosis. And then we also made sure that the beneficiaries were continuously enrolled. This was really important across both years to help verify that the diagnosis was sustained and not just a one-time code in the claims data. For incidence, we were even stricter. So beneficiaries had to be enrolled in the year before, the year of the diagnosis, and the year after. Again, all of this was, in this case, for incidence to confirm that it was a new case and not a previously diagnosed one. Overall, the goal of these exclusion and inclusion criteria is to help us improve the accuracy of the dementia identification. So we used parts A, B, and D, so we could capture hospitalizations, outpatient visits, and then also include the prescription data. The sample included the beneficiaries ages 67 and older, and And again, we excluded anybody who had missing geographic identifiers. This is what the flow chart for the analytic sample looks like. We began with an initial data set of over 12 million from 2014 to 2019. Again, because this is the 20% data, not the 100% data. We employed the two-pronged approach. First, we filtered based on the outcome. Then we filtered based on the exposure and the covariates. And then we merged the outcome-based filter data with the exposure and covariate filtered data. And then finally, we removed any records that had any missing values and ultimately resulted in a final sample of about 2.7 million beneficiaries. So this project is actually one of my first times working with claims data, and it's been quite challenging, but it's also been a wonderful learning experiences. But I think one of the biggest strengths of this data for both um, Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias and hypertension is honestly just the sheer volume and the richness of the data. We have so much data that we don't have enough time to analyze it. It's a lot. And so even after exclusions, we're talking about the scale of millions of people for 2.9 million for prevalence and about 2.4 million for incidence each year, giving us really strong power and more importantly, strong power and geographic coverage across the entire country. So it allows us to really look at population health effects here. And so again, we can look across groups, across geographies, across subgroups, and still have enough data to explore real disparities and not just noise. That said, the data set is so large that we've run into multiple times into server timeouts and model convergence issues, which is one of the reasons why we've just, to get some work done, is started to only look at the 20% sample. Okay. So diving in here for some of the models. So we used a mixed effects logistic regression model to model the odds of diagnosed dementia as a function of each ICE domain. So we adjusted for individual demographics and comorbidities and included a zip code level random intercept to account for neighborhood level clustering, or in this case, the zip code level clustering. Each ICE domain was modeled separately to assess its unique contribution for either hypertension or for dementia risk. And here's a quick breakdown of the model. So Y is the dementia diagnosis, whether it's incidence or prevalence. And then ICE is the zip code level SSP for that given domain. X is the individual covariates. U is the zip code level random effect. And the structure allows us to isolate the effect of the socioeconomic SSP while controlling for the confounders at both the individual and the zip code level. And so we had the same general model for hypertension, and I'll refer you to the papers for the association analyses in which the hypertension results were published. In AIM-2, in general, for both dementia and hypertension, we used PIMs, or population intervention models, to ask a question such as, what would dementia prevalence look like if we could reduce or eliminate disparities in SSP for a given geographic area? So completely hypothetical here. It's allowing us to simulate ideal counterfactual scenarios. Again, what would happen, for example, if everybody lived in a zip code with low polarization and compare that to what we actually observe in reality. So the difference between these scenarios gives us, as I'm sure you all know, the average treatment effect, or the ATE, which estimates the potential population level benefit of intervening on space or place-based inequities. It helps us move away from simply identifying associations, which we did earlier in the earlier slide, how much to asking how much could things improve if we change the underlying exposure environment for a given domain. And it ultimately, the goal is for it to give us a way to quantify the impact of a structural change. Again, for the goal being to identify the most impactful targeted intervention. So it helps us simulate what if scenarios. We followed four general steps. First, we estimated the association between each index and the outcomes, adjusting for the covariates. Then we created those counterfactual scenarios, adjusting ICE to multiple different things, and then applying GCOM to estimate the ATE. We bootstrapped to obtain the confidence intervals, and then ultimately that gave us these population level estimates of how much in a hypothetical scenario, really important hypothetical scenario, with the disease burden could change under different conditions. Okay, so this section will focus on first half of the results for hypertension, um, and then I'll move on to dementia. Um, so before diving into the results, I want to briefly highlight that these two papers that form the foundation for this work, the first, our team and I published it in Health in Place, and that was to examine how socioeconomic SSP impacted high blood pressure among nursing home residents in the VA. Again, really large sample size, but what was really cool there is we were able to show that folks that moved from one zip code into the nursing home, that the spillover effect of socioeconomic SSP spilled over from their zip code into their nursing home residents, which was really cool because we were able to show that even in a system like the VA that has equal access to care across groups, these inequities still persisted. So, and then that led us to the second paper that you see here, published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. This time among older adults in the regards and cardiovascular health studies, two national NIH-funded cohort studies, and we were able to examine the relationship between SSP across multiple domains and spatial scales for older adults in both of those cohorts. And both papers show that combined domain of race, ethnicity, and income was the most predictive across spatial scales and across, in this case, different populations. So digging into these results a little bit. For the study from CHS and Regards, CHS includes about 6,000 older adults that were recruited in the late 90s, and then Regards includes over 30,000 participants recruited in the early 2000s. Together, they provided a really wonderful population across regions, race, and socioeconomic backgrounds for older adults. About 26% of the combined cohorts had high BP. And average systolic blood pressure was generally higher in CHS than it was in Regards, consistent with the fact that folks are older in CHS than they are in Regards. This figure shows the distributions of SSP or ICE across the 5 domains. Again, values closer to 1 reflect higher privilege, while those closer to -1 reflect concentrated deprivation. So across both cohorts, we see a lot of variation by the domain of ICE and the spatial scale. Here you can see CHS on the left and Regards on the right for the ICE distributions for all the spatial scales that we had calculated, the county, ZECTA, and the tract. This variation really helped us with our analyses. So here's some of the regression-based results from CHS and Regards. So across domains, individuals in the most deprived areas had higher odds of high blood pressure and higher mean systolic blood pressure. Associations were strongest for folks that had, for the domains of race and race income combined measures. And then even sorry, this is suggesting that even modest shifts in SSP could potentially correspond to a meaningful difference in this case, blood pressure. So that led the way for some of our PIMS analyses. So then we shifted from the cohorts to the CMS sample. So here in the CMS sample for 2018, the hypertension prevalence in the Medicare sample was about 35%. Rates were higher among those with other chronic conditions, as we would expect. And then as we would expect, rates were observed substantial differences by race and ethnicity. And then for our PIMS analyses, so we use the PIMS to simulate how hypertension prevalence would change under different scenarios. So the prevalence again was 35% in the observed scenario, and that's that red line that you see there. So under hypothetical scenarios, let's take income, for example. If we moved everyone to a hypothetical high income neighborhood or zip code, a high income zip code, it would reduce the prevalence of hypertension to 30%. So we went from 35 to 30% if we moved everybody to a really high income area. For income and race ethnicity, if we moved everybody to a predominantly low income Black non-Hispanic zip code, we would see that the prevalence increases to 43%. So that's a 12 to 13 percentage point difference in hypertension burden that could potentially be attributable to spatial inequality along a given domain, even after accounting for demographics and comorbidities. So that takes us then to our results for dementia. Does the same track for dementia? Short answer is yes. So for dementia, the diagnosed dementia prevalence was 8.7 among those beneficiaries that were 67 and older. It declined from about 9.6 in 2015 to about 8.7 in 2018, but in general, it was steady. And it was much higher among those with comorbidities and much lower among those without. Again, this is to show that the dementia prevalence that we had in our study really tracked with other studies. So this slide here contextualizes the findings. The figure compares our prevalence estimates with prior studies. And so our studies estimate from about 2015 to about 2018 range from about 9.6 to 8.7%, which is tracking with some of the other studies here. We looked at temporal patterns by race and ethnicity, and we observed declines in diagnosed dementia across all groups, but persistent gaps remain. You could see here really clearly Black beneficiaries consistently exhibited the highest prevalence, followed by Hispanic and American Indian slash Alaska Native groups. And then non-Hispanic white beneficiaries showed the lowest rates, though the gap narrowed a little bit over time. So now looking at our ICE distributions measured across the domains, you can see again, just like for the CHS and the regards cohorts, and just like for hypertension, you can see a lot of substantial variation across the domains, especially for income and race, indicating a lot of potentially structural and socioeconomic divides. Here we're looking at dementia prevalence across quintiles of deprivation and privilege. Again, we converted the ICE into quintiles to make things a little bit easier to interpret for some of our results. For example, if we had quintile 1 to be the most deprived quintile. So quintile 1 is bad, and quintile 5 is good, is the most privileged quintile. And prevalence dropped about 10.3% in quintile 1 to about 8% in quintile 5 for income. And then for race, it went from 10.5 to 7.3. Again, showing a consistent gradient pattern with what we saw for hypertension as well. So for some of our models, for those mixed effects models for dementia, in model 1, we used the quintiles, and in model 2, we used ICE continuously. And so beneficiaries living in the most privileged quintile for dementia had about 25 lower odds of dementia compared to those in the most deprived quintile. And for model 2, where we modeled ICE as a continuous variable, the relationship remained strong and highly significant. Each 1 unit increase in ICE reflected greater privilege corresponding to a 37% reduction in the odds of dementia. I like the PIMS results because I think it's a little easier to explain. So for PIMS for dementia, again, we're asking the what if question. So the orange bars represent a scenario where everybody lives in maximally deprived neighborhoods, and the green bars represent maximally privileged scenarios. The red dashed line again shows our observed prevalence, and then again across all the domains, the dementia prevalence would theoretically rise substantially under deprivation and fall under privilege. Again, most notably for income and race-based measures. So, in summary, neither dementia and hypertension, they're not just individually determined. They're shaped by spatial patterns in this case, in area levels, spatial social polarization. And we focused here on establishing the association between SSP and dementia and hypertension across multiple domains and multiple spatial levels. And pretty much the key takeaway here is area level SSP is measurable and it's potentially modifiable driver of both hypertension and dementia risk. So before wrapping up, I just want to say that this is now where I'll go into my disclaimer. So even though I think indices like ICE are super powerful, again, I'm funded to continue advancing this work. I also believe they are fundamentally flawed and limited in what they can tell us about the environment. It's a lot to ask for any given measure. I understand why they're attractive because they're easy to calculate, they're easy to model, they're easy to interpret, but I don't think any single measure can distill something as complex, as layered, and as dynamic as the environment into one number. It's, again, a lot to ask for. So while I think these indices have moved our field forward, I want to gently challenge our reliance on them. I've talked a lot about this at multiple conferences, but so I just wanted to give you a brief overview of this. I want us to, as a field, to push us to think differently about how we conceptualize and measure the environment itself, since the environment has such a profound impact on our health. And to that end, I think, going back here, I think this shift starts with how we define what we're trying to measure. So we can't fully answer what's in a place, which is a lot of what folks ask about when they ask about the environment, without asking about what's in a space and how both of those interact. I think it's super important that when we are examining the environment, to examine both the spaces and the places. And again, a lot of folks use these interchangeably, but I think distinguishing them is important. So space refers to the physical environment where people live, move, and age, and place reflects to the social environment and the structures that are layered on to that geographic space, things that are shaped by history, policy, and power. And the two are always in reality experienced together. And in the context of health disparities, I think that overlap is exactly where inequities are shaped and take place. So I think we have to examine them together. But I don't think we can do that with current tools that we have. And that's why we need better tools in spatial epidemiology in general. The environments that we inhabit, they're complex, they're dynamic, they're overlapping. So the traditional methods that we have to examine exposures have constantly, such as the ones that I've showed you, looked at exposures as static and one-dimensional. They've traditionally linked exposures to residential areas, to where people live, but that's not just the only environment that individuals inhabit, right? We go to school, we go to work, we live in our homes, our environments and our life spaces and our activity spaces are much broader than just the residential space. So even with newer approaches, we usually capture about one or two aspects of the environment, like race or income, in either space or place, but we never look at them together. So I think that narrow view limits our understanding of how these inequalities truly operate. So I think we need tools that are flexible, scalable, and multidimensional. And that's where I think AI comes in, specifically this emerging field of GeoAI. It's not a new field, but there are some aspects of it that I think could be really relevant to our work for spatial and social epidemiology. So in this recent paper from Health and Place, we're discussing how AI can extend some of these traditional spatial and life course methods and help us handle the scale, the complexity, and the resolution of our modern data sets like the claims data sets that I showed you. So GeoAI I think, has a lot of potentials, and if funded, I'd love to continue with this work, but it can allow us to extract environmental features from high resolution imagery super fast, things like Google Street View. It can allow us to reconstruct historical exposures for environments. It can allow us to handle multi-level data across both spaces and places and time, and then hopefully allow us to identify novel predictors of health outcomes that are potentially modifiable. Because I can't stop talking about this. We had a session about this that really showcased wonderful work at SCR on AI and machine learning, specifically for cognitive health and aging. And it was so well attended that it's now becoming a standing session at SCR. And I think that points to that a lot of people are craving some of these new methods to implement into our work. And then lastly, a super shameless plug here, that we have an upcoming Health in Place special issue that I'm co-editing with some wonderful colleagues, titled Aging in Place and Space, Contextual Influences on Health and Cognition. And our deadline has been extended to January 2026. If you or your colleagues would like to submit, please feel free to reach out. So thanks again for having me. This work is not possible at all without wonderful collaborators and mentors that I'm really fortunate to work with. Special shout out to our immediate team, including postdoc Mengya Xu, who's just the best, and Waylin, research scientist Waylin in our department, and research coordinator Evelyn. Again, work would not be possible without them. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great job. Any questions? Because oh, good.
So going back to one of your final discussion slides about being able to alter modifiable risk factors, as I look down that list, a lot of them don't seem that modifiable to me. So which ones do you think would be targets for trying to improve health outcomes?
Yeah. I agree with you. Some of them may not be modifiable as we think. I think again, that points to the need to try to pinpoint exactly a modifiable factor in an environment and exactly where, for a given, for example, for our country, for a given state, exactly which area we would have the most effect since, for a given outcome, since we can't target everyone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I can't just, I have some follow-ups on that because, so, I mean, speaking of the targeting, have you tried doing that? Like imagine when you change income, you did it broadly, right? Across all whatever spatial, zip codes or what have you. You could imagine that it's more practical to have something where there's an urban versus rural type of impact. I mean, just as one example, and there's different percentile increases if given certain policies or something.
Right.
Right.
Yes. That's part of the work for the structural SSP measures. I completely agree. Yeah.
And then the other with the interpretation, because I mean, one of those that you did in a hypothetical was changing race and ethnicity. What is the interpretation of that? That's the change in a neighborhood's diversity and mixture, right? Or what is that?
Yeah, I think it's saying, I think what it's saying is that it's saying if we, even after adjusting for everything, just the specific dynamics of a given area has an impact on health. And so in this case, it's the polarization, for example, the residential segregation or the polarization for race and ethnicity for a given area. But yes, it is saying if we moved everybody to a specific neighborhood that had a specific dynamic for race and ethnicity, what would be the impact on the given outcome? Again, I agree. It's not something that's the most modifiable, but I think it is pointing to underlying things that are modifiable that I think we have yet to figure out what they are.
I mean, that measure of ICE for race and ethnicity is a percentile of individuals in certain population descriptor groups. So changing that, does that point to having more diversity or less within that group, right? Because what's that level of change within it? Because ICE is a measure of polarization or variation within,
Mhm.
right? Not homogeneity. So
Yeah.
you see what I'm at?
I think let me see if I understand. So I think changing that would mean that the area is less polarized. It wouldn't have one group be the group that's more predominant. It would changing that would mean that there's less polarization, and no polarization would mean that the ice is zero for that given area, so that the groups are perfectly balanced. Again, a scenario that's not super realistic, right? Probably not even possible, but it is everybody is perfectly balanced in terms of their sociodemographic factors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other?
Hi, I have a couple of questions. Hi, Hoda. Thank you for the talk. I think this is really great, and I completely agree with everything that you were saying about how we need to change our way of thinking about health disparities and race and ethnicity to kind of think of different levels and whatnot. Kind of in brainstorming mode. So, my first one is: have you thought about using other sort of spatial measures like GI star measures or something like that in conjunction with the spatial polarization methods, just to get a little bit more information about not just spatial polarization within the census tract, but also about the nearby areas?
No, I haven't, but that's a really great suggestion. Thank you. I'm writing it down.
Yeah, and happy to chat more about this, because we've done some of this. We've measured some of these things in a cohort that I work with. And then another sort of brainstorming sort of idea, moving away from the structural, but more into the social, is I'm wondering if, just because I think a lot of this, as we sort of start thinking about what are the mechanisms through which this kind of impacts people, right? And one of the big ones that I can think of with racism in general is stress, right? And so I was wondering if also you have thought about using some estimates from I always say it wrong, the BRFSS, the BARFs, or other measurements like Project Implicit that in some way kind of get at more social perceptions or attitudes about different groups within these that can also be aggregated at different levels, just as a way of kind of thinking about either interactions or unique contributions or unique explanation of variance relevant to these other spatial measures.
Yeah. Again, a wonderful idea. I haven't, but I know folks that have in both Burfus and other cohorts. A name comes to mind. She does wonderful work in this area, Dana Johnson. Forget which institution Dana is at, but she does wonderful work in this area. But no, I haven't thought about combining those two things. I think, again, that would be really great to look at, which is, again, another reason why I think the GOAI methods are really important, because just the sheer amount of data and variables that we would try to parse through, whether it's stress or other upstream or downstream variables, it's a lot. It's a lot to try to figure out its impact on a given outcome. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you.
Great. Any more questions?
So one more.
Go ahead,
So
yeah.
on the AI part, I understood you to say you could use AI to assign exposures spatially or maybe covariates or what have you. But then you're also thinking about AI to relate all of these exposures, et cetera, to your health outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. Across the entire pipeline. So many people do this so wonderfully and so easily in CS, in computer vision, and a lot of other fields. And I feel, and they use AI genuinely and really thoroughly in other fields. But they have horrible data compared to us. We have such wonderful data, but we don't use the best of methods. And they use really great methods, but have horrible data. So I think if we were to just start using the methods that they're using, I think we would really excel. Yeah.
I think there's many in this room that are smiling now, thinking you should collaborate on computational ideas and other things.
Yeah, you should
For
come
that.
talk. You should come talk to us.
Yes.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to.
Your data is amazing. So
And that is why I wanted her to speak.
Thank
It
you.
worked. All right.
I love to.
Any
Thank
other
you so much.
questions? Anything? That was great. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Okay. Thank you all. See you next time. Thanks, Hoda. No, she's off, but yeah. Go, yeah, send her an email. Just, yeah, that'd be great.